Good afternoon. We are so very glad that you are here with us. Welcome to RCRC's webinar, The Role of White Christian Women in the Anti-Abortion Movement. You may or may not know, but this is part of a series of webinars that we have been doing this winter. We will have our final one for the winter series on Tuesday, March 30th, and this is behind the legislative curtain. We will have state legislator with us talking about the kinds of practices that happen within state legislatures as they are promoting, many of them promoting anti-abortion legislation and anti-women's autonomy legislation of all types, and talking with us about what kinds of strategies might faith communities engage that really helps to shift the dynamics that are happening across so many states. So I hope you will join us for that one. Then we will take a break from our webinar series for a few months, and then we will be launching our online courses. They will be self-paced, and they're really exciting. The people we have lined up for those courses, you won't want to miss. I'm really serious. I'm excited. I've been learning some amazing things from all of our presenters. So keep a watchful ear and eye for that, as we will be sharing that with you very soon. So today I'm so excited because the amazing people we have here, they have been working with and living with the issues as it deals with the anti-abortion movement in some very significant ways. They are not anti-abortionists, I want to emphasize that, but they will help us look at what the dialogue, the conversation, some of the rationale has been, so that we can be much more effective and more comprehensive in our work for reproductive freedom. I want to say this too, and then I'm going to move out of the way really quickly, but I want to say thank you for all those who asked us, who were the people? They were all white women. Are they white anti-abortionists? Are they white Christian women? Who are they? So we're really excited by all of the questions that we have received from our broad audience, and thank you for the engagement that you bring. And I was glad to be able to say to people, we're going to be looking at the issues of racism in this conversation. And so that's a big part of what we will be doing. I'm going to move out of the way now, and I'm going to introduce to you our wonderful moderator for today, who will then introduce our speakers today. My friend Ashley Peterson is the founder and executive director of Faith in Women, a progressive network of Mississippi clergy and people of faith who are committed to advancing reproductive health, rights, and justice in Mississippi. And she works with individuals and organizations across the country. Ashley is a native Mississippian and began her career as a health educator and nutrition counselor. And that work was specifically with low-income women and families across the South. Ashley now leads Faith in Women with an understanding of health and wholeness that is rooted in faith, justice, and best healthcare practices in the community. Ashley, my friend, thank you so very much for doing this with us today.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm so excited to be here. And as Carrie said, I am the director of Faith in Women in Mississippi, which was formed in 2015 in response to the onslaught of abortion restrictions passed every year by our state legislature. We've seen everything from personhood bills, trap laws, 20-week, 15-week, 6-week, and even full-out abortion bans. Currently, there is one abortion clinic serving the entire state, while as of 2018, there were over 30 crisis pregnancy centers. And the main actors behind these anti-abortion efforts in Mississippi are white, self-identified Christians from largely evangelical and Catholic traditions who claim to be upholding their religious values and protecting life, while they simultaneously dismantle life-giving social safety nets for families and children across the state. And these measures disproportionately affect Mississippi's Black families and communities, which furthers our state's legacy of racialized reproductive oppression. White Christian men may get most of the spotlight as legislators, but white Christian women are the ones who vote, staff the CPCs, march, protest the clinics, and perpetuate a culture of shame and stigma around reproductive decision-making. And in many ways, they're the backbone of the anti-abortion movement. So a question that our organization grapples with in Mississippi is, how did we get here? And what is the way forward to a more just and compassionate future for all of us? And I hope that you are all ready to dig into that with us today. Over the next hour and 15 minutes, you will hear from three amazing panelists who will explore the role of white Christian women in the anti-abortion movement. They will cover some history and analysis, some personal experience, and connect the dots to show how anti-abortion activism is one manifestation of some much larger issues. There will be lots of time at the end for audience Q&A. You can use the Q&A box to put your questions. You can chat with each other in the chat box, but make sure that any questions you have for the panelists go in the Q&A. So yeah, we hope you will leave today with a better understanding and maybe some ideas for a path forward in your own communities. I'd like to introduce our three panelists. First, you will hear from Dr. Chrissy Stroop. Chrissy is a writer, scholar, and ex-evangelical who holds a PhD in history and interdisciplinary studies in the humanities from Stanford University. She has taught at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration in Moscow, Russia, and at the University of South Florida in Tampa. Chrissy has published academic articles as well as policy research and popular commentary and journalism for a variety of outlets, including Political Research Associates, Foreign Policy, Playboy Magazine, and Religion Dispatches. Then next, you will hear from Dr. Carissa Haugeberg. Carissa is an associate professor of history at Tulane University. Her book, Women Against Abortion, Inside the Largest Moral Reform of the 20th Century, charts the experiences of women who shaped the contemporary anti-abortion movement. Carissa also co-edited the 9th edition of Women's America, Refocusing the Past, a popular textbook used to study the history of women and gender in the United States. And Carissa's next book project is Nursing Revolution, Civil Rights, Feminism, and the American Nursing Profession from 1965 to 1990. And then wrapping us up will be Dr. Jennifer Holland. Jennifer is an assistant professor of U.S. history at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in histories of gender, sexuality, and race in the 20th century North American West. She's also a core affiliate member of the Women and Gender Studies Department. Her book, Tiny U, A Western History of the Anti-Abortion Movement, explains how anti-abortion activists made the political personal to many white Americans and changed the partisan politics of much of the American West. So thank you to all of you for being here. And now I will turn it over to Chrissy Stroop, who will be joining us on audio.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that warm introduction. And thank you very much, Carrie, for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion. It's always a pleasure to work with you and the folks at the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. I do apologize for only streaming my audio today rather than video. Unfortunately, just a few days ago, I came down with a salivary gland infection, which is about as much fun as it sounds. And so I kind of look like a mutant chipmunk at the moment. I got on a course of antibiotics starting yesterday, but I may not be at my absolute most coherent today. So I ask you all to bear with me if that is the case. Now, I am a credentialed historian like the other panelists here, but my field, and I'm not really working in the field anymore, was modern Russian history rather than the American religious right. Much of the work that I've done, though, has sort of brought those things full circle. There are more connections than you might think. And I'm here today mainly to provide the perspective of someone who grew up in the Christian right in the 1980s, right as the anti-abortion activism was really taking off. A lot of people might think that that happened just if you were trying to sort of think in your head, well, we know the moral majority started in the 70s. What was this all about? But yeah, Roe was not a big deal. 1973 was not a huge big deal to most white evangelical Christians, not until mobilizing around it started later in the 70s, when people like Paul Weyrich thought this could be a good issue to get Catholics and Protestants voting together for Republicans. And that really crystallized in the 1980 election, when, of course, Ronald Reagan was elected with large evangelical support, and the evangelicals became, the Christian right became an important political bloc as we know it now. 1980 is also the year I was born. So by way of introduction there, that's a little bit of my positionality toward this issue. And I'm here mostly to, as I said, to kind of talk about what that milieu is like. What are what roles do women play in this kind of conservative Christian environment as I observed it growing up and in my life. I also want to say, with respect to my positionality toward this issue, I am a trans woman. I have never been able to get pregnant. And so I just want to make sure that I put that out there, and that I'm very aware of that, but also always feeling off and different as a child made me a very cerebral kid, and kind of able to step back and observe what was going on around me. And so that's hopefully helps give me some insights into these issues. So let me just tell you what it was like being a kid in the 80s in a very evangelical environment. I went to a Christian school, K through 12, where my mom was the teacher. And on one of the hallways in the elementary school, we had part of Psalm 33:12 emblazoned in huge letters. It said, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." So, this kind of Christian nationalism is it's the lens through which we interpreted that. And basically, the kids at that school clearly came to understand this meant a few things. It meant that our nation was supposed to obey God, or bad things would happen. And what did our nation obeying God mean? It meant that we needed to ban abortion, keep queer people from having rights, and get officially sanctioned Bible reading and Protestant prayer back in public schools. It meant those three things. Kids in this environment, as young as 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, were taken to school assemblies where we were taught that there are these horrible liberals out there and they're murdering babies. I remember one where, and it was a white woman giving the presentation, of course, and showing great concern about, how awful this is, that people are killing babies, women are killing their own babies, and it's because these evil liberals are telling them that's what they should do. She had a sort of like traffic light, signal type light as a visual aid. And the yellow would flash every few seconds. And she said, every time that this light flashes, another baby is murdered. And, when you get that message, I was probably about 7 years old, it really sticks with you. Meanwhile, at both school and church, I saw a lot of evangelical activism spearheaded by the women around me related to the crisis pregnancy centers, CPCs, which used very deceptive and manipulative practices to recruit women away from women's healthcare clinics where they will get proper information, give them lots of disinformation, and in many cases work closely with Christian adoption agencies like Bethany Christian Services to try to coerce women into giving up babies that they might actually want to keep. So there's a whole lot of dubious practices that go on with that. But in my childhood milieu, generally it was women who were leading drives for diapers and other sorts of resources for these CPCs, who were volunteering or working at the CPCs. Saw this as one of the best examples of how to be a good Christian woman, right, was to work with the CPCs and to work politically to end abortion. I didn't grow up in the sort of most extreme version of evangelicalism either. We were what I would now call sort of respectable evangelicals. Our sense of ourselves was that we were not racist because we were colorblind. Narrator, we were very racist. But you know, and I could see that play out too in some of what was going on around me with respect to abortion, CPCs, and adoption. You know, I would overhear the women, my mother and other church women in the environment, you know, talking about these women whose children they're hoping to adopt. You know, they've been maybe talked out of having an abortion, or maybe they didn't even want to have an abortion, but they've gotten sort of roped into this CPC world and Christian adoption world. And now they're trying to talk them out of keeping their child. I heard with great fear discussions of, you know, but now it seems like this mother, and in many cases this would be a Black mother, you know, is maybe going to change her mind and keep the child, and wouldn't that just be horrible? And so there's a whole lot of paternalism going on there. And something that I've also learned from talking to adult adoptees in recent years, which is something that I've done some investigative journalism on, is kind of abusive practices historically and in the present in the adoption industry, is that most adult adoptees don't think poverty should ever be a reason that, you know, a child is separated from its birth mother. But obviously that was not something that the white women in my environment as a kid were concerned about. They wanted to get these kids into good Christian homes, right? In other words, they continued to perpetuate the practices of what historians of adoption call the baby scoop era, which is a big boom in adoptions starting after World War II, and most historians place the end of it around 1973 with Roe v. Wade, though some might place it a little later. This was also a period when, you know, a lot of Native American children were taken, put into residential schools, put into white homes, had their culture just destroyed by white Christian Americans. And a law passed to address that, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, was not passed until 1978. One other thing that I observed, you know, as just someone, as a kid, just kind of watching, well, what are the ladies who are doing this saying about it here? Is that it seems like women were considered extra saintly if they adopted African-American kids or kids with special needs. We do know that in the adoption industry, it actually costs more to adopt a white baby than a baby of color. So the systemic racism there is such that it shows that, you know, most white families who adopt do want to adopt white babies, but certainly in my environment, it was sort of part of the paternalism. You know, a woman was viewed as extra godly if she adopted a Black or a brown child, I mean, if her family did. So that's what it was sort of like, just living through this as a kid. I call it being a child of the culture wars. You know, this is just one aspect of it. I was also taken to an anti-abortion protest at age 11. It was something called the Life Chain. It was a national protest that took place in 1991. But my family wasn't mostly the type that was in the streets picketing, but, you know, the type that was advocating for and volunteering with the CPCs. Well, certainly my mother. You know, it wasn't really a man's thing to do, right? So my dad wasn't particularly involved. And I found that as I've started to deconstruct all of this, and, you know, now I am both progressive and an atheist, and, you know, and fully accepting and recognizing of my queerness that it took me a long time to even recognize and come to terms with. I found that through this whole process of just unpacking all of this from my childhood, that belief that was just pounded into my head as a kid, that abortion is murder, was one of the hardest things for me to shake. You know, even after I started voting for Democrats, even after I started, you know, saying, well, okay, I don't think abortion should really be just banned, but sure, it would be a good thing if we could reduce the number of abortions and so forth. it was just hard to shake the idea that it was murder. And I know now that thanks to, now I know the science that, makes that claim ridiculous, but I think you have to unpack this stuff on an emotional level. And it was when I finally came to understand that if you just look at the policy outcomes of just trying to ban abortion, it is really very much about controlling women and not caring about the collateral damage. I think that's what ultimately changed my mind, because you can point to all kinds of policies that do reduce the rate of abortions that happen in a given country or state, things like comprehensive sex ed, access to contraceptions, access to paid leave for childbirth and paid parental leave for child rearing, that sort of thing. None of that stuff is anything that conservatives want. So, it seems pretty clear that it's not so much those fetuses that they're really concerned about, but it took me a while to reach that conclusion. Of course, they like to call fetuses unborn babies, and unborn babies are just a really convenient sort of proxy for their culture wars, because they never talk back, right? You can save the babies. They're the perfect object of white saviorism because they can't talk back to you. So I guess I'll just sort of stop there. I hope that was relatively coherent. If not, I do apologize as I'm dealing with this pretty painful infection, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Now we will turn it over to Carissa Haugeberg.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you today. I have such admiration for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Rights. And I'd like to thank Professor Gil Frank for initiating my participation in today's panel. And I'd also like to thank the Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson, Ashley Peterson, and Melanie Bui Larson for organizing today's event. So today I'm going to focus on two related themes of my book, Women Against Abortion. I'll discuss how some progressive feminist identified women became attracted to anti-abortion activism in the 1970s. I'll also discuss how anti-abortion activism offered conservative, Catholic, and evangelical women opportunities to criticize clergy, husbands, and male physicians, and to establish themselves as unself-conscious leaders of one of the most powerful reform movements of the 20th century. Each chapter of my book focuses on a different woman who was prominent in the US anti-abortion movement between the late 1960s and the early 2000s. And the tenor of the book, it just kind of becomes more dramatic as it goes along. I start with kind of the peaceful Catholic women at clinics, and it concludes with a woman who shot Dr. George Tiller, Shelley Shannon, and kind of charts how we got there, how this violence escalated within the movement. So one of the women I profile early in the book is named Julie Lesh. And she had identified as a progressive Catholic since the 1960s. As a teenager, she registered African-American voters in her hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania. When she was only 15 years old, she boarded a bus to travel to Washington, D.C. to protest the war in Vietnam. In 1970, 19-year-old Lesh dropped out of Antioch College in Ohio in order to travel to California, where she learned the strategies of nonviolent protest with Cesar Chavez. Lesh acknowledged that she was more invigorated by social justice work than the tenets of Catholicism. In 1972, Lesh returned home to Erie, where she and several progressive Benedictine sisters founded the Pax Center, which was a residential feminist community based on the Catholic worker model. Lesh worked with nuns and other lay associates to promote peace and to feed hungry Pennsylvanians. When Lesh reflected on her religious and political sensibilities during this time, she said that she was a soft-core pro-choice feminist who was more concerned about nuclear proliferation than the politics of abortion. So what changed? How did this progressive Catholic woman who is so deeply invested in social justice work become a key leader in anti-abortion politics? So Lesh has two conversion stories, and I'm just going to focus on the one that she tells most frequently. So according to Lesh, the turning point came in 1978 when she encountered a group of women protesting in front of one of Erie's abortion clinics. To her delight, she found that the protesters did not conform to the stereotype that she had of right-wing women. Instead, she described them as interesting, individual, even a little quirky. In other words, not so different from herself. Lesh, a young college dropout who wanted to get married and have children, but was surrounded by older women who had taken vows of chastity, was energized by the anti-abortion movement. I'm not the first scholar to observe that anti-abortion activists' theatrical demonstrations included echoes of civil rights and anti-war demonstrations. For example, consider those who participate in clinic invasions. They sometimes call these actions sit-ins. In 1980, Julie Lesh, who had recently formed a dual anti-abortion, anti-nuclear proliferation group called Pro-Lifers for Survival. If you've never heard of this, it's for good reason. It never really it never took off, this anti-nuke, anti-abortion group. With this group, she supervised a demonstration at the Pentagon. Lesh and her colleagues staged a fake childbirth, replete with fake blood, hoping to court the attention of passersby and the press. But again, you can see she's using this drama that she'd cultivated in these early movements and now is getting some traction in the anti-abortion movement. So for her, especially in these early years, she's having a tremendous amount of fun. And I think that's something that is important to kind of key in on, like, why would people do this? A similarity shared by many of the women I profile in the book is that their anti-abortion work offered acceptable avenues for them to criticize clergy, husbands, and patriarchy. As Julie Lesh became more invested in anti-abortion politics, she lashed out at her colleagues at the PAC Center. It is notable that both Lesh and her progressive Catholic friends believed in the consistent life ethic, but interpreted its significance differently. In 1983, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin introduced the term consistent life ethic, hoping to unite Catholics who are invested in a variety of moral issues, from abortion and birth control to poverty to the death penalty and euthanasia. In other words, he hoped that Catholic activists might see themselves as partners, working to protect life from conception to death. And again, to bring together kind of these more progressive people with the more conservative people. But this framing, the consistent life ethic, which was intended to unite progressives and conservatives, failed to stop the church from dividing. To her dismay, many of Julie Lesh's old friends from the farm workers movement and anti-poverty campaigns either opposed or were disinterested in anti-abortion activism. Many worried that it was a distraction, that the time and resources ought to be devoted to alleviating the suffering they saw before them every day. Another woman I profile in the book, Joan Andrews, who had been a lifelong devout Catholic, fumed when her parish priest in rural Tennessee would not support the nascent anti-abortion movement in her region. So again, just a brief aside for a second, it's notable that the Catholic Church has become so closely identified with anti-abortion and anti-birth control politics. And of course, this group in particular is, I'm sure, well aware of the importance of groups like Catholics for Choice. But it's also important to recognize that some of the loudest anti-abortion Catholics of the 1970s and 1980s were defiant because many of their colleagues, including clerical leaders, were ambivalent about abortion or were pro-choice. So I'm going to whet your appetite for Professor Gil Frank's forthcoming book on pro-choice religious and clerical work by pointing out that many of the men and women who had been attracted to the Catholic Church in the wake of Vatican II those who embraced the church's potential to be a force for social justice understood anti-abortion laws as antithetical to their support for gender and racial equality. So again, we've kind of have this amnesia about the Catholic Church in the 1960s and 1970s. Again, many of those young nuns and priests were either ambivalent or were pro-choice. So Julie Lesh's life captures a schism that is likely to familiar to many of us gathered here today. Julie Lesh, like other women I profile in the book, came to regard support for or opposition to abortion rights as a litmus test. For Lesh, opposition to the death penalty or initiatives to alleviate food insecurity rang hollow if people did not also actively work to oppose abortion. This strict framing caused her to lash out and enabled her to justify lashing out at her former friends. In 1988, the prominent evangelical anti-abortion leader Randall Terry, the founder of Operation Rescue, hired Julie Lesh to train his followers and to teach them the dramatic protest strategies that she had been honing since the 1960s. Although Lesh insisted that protesters sign nonviolent pledges, Operation Rescue members nevertheless routinely entered clinics and harassed and intimidated staff and patients alike. And it wasn't uncommon for people to be injured during these, so they were decidedly violent. Lesh rationalized the dissonance between nonviolent protest traditions and the strategies deployed by her new colleagues by pointing to the number of fetuses that she believed that OR members had saved by shutting down clinics. Lesh's engagement with Operation Rescue and evangelical Christians ended up being a mixed bag. On one hand, she fulfilled her decade-long mission to find a husband. She married an evangelical Christian man whom she'd met at a clinic protest. Again, something that probably would not have, or was less likely to happen had she stayed at the PAC Center. But on the other hand, she lost ties to the colleagues. Oh, something might be rubbing against my mic. It's my paper. Thank you for letting me know. So on the other hand, so again, it's a mixed bag. She finds a husband, but on the other hand, she lost her ties with the colleagues whose values had aligned with her own for so many decades. Lesh was furious when she discovered that Randall Terry met only with men and paid them more than she had been paid. So the architect of many of the organization's most stunning protests was effectively shunted out of the group's leadership because of her gender. In 1990, she left the group to become a stay-at-home mom in Tennessee. Finally, I'd like to leave you with an observation that might stimulate questions for all of the panelists at the end during our Q&A. It's notable that while diverse groups of people, white, Latino, Asian and African American, rich and poor, Catholic and Muslim, have identified as opponents of legal abortion, the overwhelming number of those who have committed acts of violence in the name of the movement have been Christian, cisgendered, heterosexual white Americans. In the conclusion to my book, I observe how law enforcement and district attorneys consistently refuse to see white Christian women as capable of violence. We might engage in a conversation about why this has been the case and what the history of the anti-abortion movement might teach us about the history of white supremacy in the United States. So thanks again so much for inviting me to speak. It's been fun getting this panel organized and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Carissa. I want to check out your book. I'd like to remind the audience to please submit any questions that you have for our panelists in the Q&A function of the webinar. And you can also upvote questions that you see posted there that you would like to be answered. So please don't forget. And now I will turn it over to Jennifer Holland.
Thank you. I also wanted to thank everyone at RCRC this is just a wonderful opportunity, and especially Dr. Jackson, Reverend Jackson, pardon me. Everyone's doctor to me. This is really great, and this is like an organization that I think is one of my favorites in the whole world. So I really love the opportunity to speak here. And actually, my book is about sort of intimate activism and how this movement, one of its biggest successes is sort of changing individual white religious people's sense of self, and really connecting it to these particular politics. But today I really want to sort of center in on one part, and that's about sort of the making of religious coalitions in the anti-abortion movement, how Catholics and evangelicals and Mormons were able to sort of get over those thorny religious differences and find common politics. And I want to conclude with the ways in which this helps us understand both sort of whiteness in the movement and also the particular place of white women in the movement. So the first hurdle, which I'm not going to talk in depth too much about, but the first hurdle is actually getting all these denominations within the denomination itself on board. And of course, that was never even and consistent. It's something that Dr. Haugeberg just talked about, but I think it cannot be stressed enough, right? That the Catholic Church, while had a long history of opposing abortion, especially in the 60s, it was really divided about whether its long-standing political commitments were outdated. And the Mormon Church in the 60s and 70s considered abortion sinful, but not on par with murder. It said they were different. And of course, evangelicals also in the 60s, a lot of evangelical denominations were ambivalent or even supportive of abortion reform. And so there's a lot of work I'm really not going to talk about, but I think it's absolutely essential that anti-abortion activists do within their denominations in the 70s and 80s to politicize their religious spaces and really connect their identities as whatever type of Christian they were to these politics. But religious coalitions, not just religious people, were necessary for this movement for a couple of reasons. So the coalitions accentuated the claim that this was not just a Catholic movement, right? In the 60s and 70s, a lot of Americans found Catholic movements unpalatable. They thought they were infringing on individual rights, right? They were narrowly religious. And so coalitions allowed them to say, this isn't just Catholic. Also, these coalitions became really central to the claim that this was a moral movement that represented all Americans, right? And finally, it was about building real political power that could sway elections, that you needed coalitions. But the coalitions, they weren't seamless, they weren't conflict-free. There were incredible challenges to these religious coalitions, especially among these particular religious groups. So between the 1940s and the 1960s, of course, there were ecumenical movements, but those movements were largely dominated by mainstream Protestants who were searching for common theological ground, hoping to overcome denominational conflict. And at the same time, we have American intellectuals using this phrase, the Judeo-Christian tradition, often to distinguish the West from the anti-Semitic Nazism or later atheistic communism in their formulation. But in all of this sort of ecumenical work of the 1940s through the 60s, Catholics, evangelicals, and Mormons rejected these attempts to build common theological ground. They were worried that it would sort of water down their claims to absolute religious truth. So these were the groups sort of before the anti-abortion movement that were most uncomfortable with monotheistic pluralism. And some of this like reticence about coalition building did bleed into the anti-abortion movement of the 70s and 80s. You have groups that were some dominated by Catholics, some by evangelicals. And one place we can see this is in crisis pregnancy centers, which a couple people have mentioned. But I want to say that this segregation wasn't just because people preferred their own, but because they really disagreed about the role of proselytizing in their work. So in a lot of Catholic CPCs, They said, we pray to the girl, we don't preach to her. Whereas a lot of evangelicals thought that the crisis of an unplanned pregnancy was the perfect time to offer their religious testimony, right? And so because of this, especially in really big cities that supported a whole host of CPCs, evangelicals and Catholics worked separately and often refused to work with one another. There were antagonisms between them. And even within groups that had sort of mixed religious membership, there were tensions, and especially around what role religion would take. So I did a lot of interviews for my book, and I interviewed one Colorado Right to Life activist who, according to her, was the token Protestant in the early 70s in that group. And she said there was this one time she really remembered where she was on the board, the rest of the board was Catholic, and they were drawing up bylaws. And there was, she put forward that in the bylaws, it should say they pray before and after each meeting. And the rest of the board said no. And she said she remembered thinking, I can't work with these people who aren't willing to put this in the bylaws. She stayed, in fact, she stayed for 3 decades, and she took solace that they always prayed, but even though it wasn't in the bylaws. But this story highlights like how she felt very different from her Catholic compatriots and how delicate this religious coalition was, right? That this issue about prayer in the bylaws might have been enough to shatter this, alliance. And yet these religious coalitions were absolutely essential for the movement. And they built them through a number of ways. I want to talk about 2 big ways I think they built them. One was discursive bridge building that would have been foreign to these exact groups just a few years before. So rather than or in an attempt to not step on anyone's toes, in the 70s, these anti-abortion activists borrow some of that earlier ecumenical rhetoric from mainstream Protestants. So in the 70s, the idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition had begun to fall out of public favor. People were beginning to criticize it, saying it sort of glorified an oppressive American past. And so this is the moment where it's receiving the most intellectual criticism it had ever experienced. And at that moment is when social conservatives embrace it for themselves and remake it. And so they have this very clear narrative about what the Judeo-Christian tradition meant to them. They said, the Greeks and Romans had allowed abortion, and then monotheists had provided this radical break from that. That the United States was the perfect articulation of Judeo-Christian values. And then the sexual modernity of the 70s and 80s was going to fundamentally undermine both the nation and those values. And so the 70s and 80s, rather than get into debates about theology, you have all of these anti-abortion activists and religious leaders talk about their shared Judeo-Christian tradition and values, and they center their opposition to abortion as the evidence of what they had in common from that monotheistic tradition. And so this rhetoric, which they had refused to use before, and then they borrowed from mainstream Protestants, it was such a valuable tool for them from the 70s onward. It was nationalistic, it was religious, but it was also capacious because it could include Catholics and Protestants and Mormons, and even Jews if they wanted to join, right? It could include everyone in this narrative. But these coalitions were more than just rhetoric, because often in small towns, they had to rely on a religiously diverse group of people for their work. And they had to enact what it meant to be a part of a Judeo-Christian anti-abortion world. And one place I saw them really doing that was outside of abortion clinics in their protests. There, they really forged this alternative religious space where they really renamed religion and claimed it as their own, and made it an ecumenical, socially conservative vision. So they integrated their sort of religious a whole host of religious tools with anti-abortion ephemera and merged them into this this space where religion and politics really merged seamlessly. And anyone who's been around an abortion clinic knows exactly what this looks like, right? That there's constant prayers. Maybe Catholics are saying the rosary and Protestants have more evangelical tempos to it. They're encircled with signs citing scripture and commandments and religious themes paired with fetal imagery. One particular example I really liked was in 1983, there was a protest where, or this is a particularly creative activist, she was carrying a homemade crucifix, a big one. But instead of Jesus crucified, it was a baby doll, right, representing the fetus. So this full fusion, right, of religion and politics here. And also, you know, everyone involved really hoped for conversion in these spaces, that all these activists who are sort of besieging these clinics, they see themselves as saving souls in addition to stopping abortions, and they don't necessarily have a denominational avenue for that salvation. They envision stopping the abortion as the first step towards that. So, and you have activists really talking about these spaces as spaces of ministry and spaces that are akin to chapels. Ones that are fundamentally ecumenical because they necessarily incorporated all of these different groups. So they're making Judeo-Christian values their vision of them, right? This socially conservative anti-abortion vision. They're sort of making them a reality for these activists outside of clinics. And they're also asking observers to see the same thing, right? See the clinics through their eyes, see the clinics as a battle where good and evil is happening, seeing them as representing a uniform religious voice, right? And of course, this was especially important in the rescue movement in the 80s and 90s, where you have Catholics and evangelicals participating and sitting in jail together. And a lot of those conversations, they said they felt like they found common ground in their religion, especially when they got to the part about how they got to their activism, right? So this didn't water down doctrinal difference between them. It didn't push them to abandon their denominational commitments, but Judeo-Christian values as it was practiced for them in anti-abortion activism felt like a meaningful way where they created some sort of pan-religious morality that they could claim as their own, and also sideline all these other religious people who are making alternative claims, right? So I guess I want to talk about two different outcomes real quick in terms of race and gender. I think that this anti-abortion Judeo-Christian ecumenism was incredibly important for social conservatives in their quest to claim moral authority in modern America. They were already co-opting anti-slavery, the rhetoric of anti-slavery activists and Nazi opponents and civil rights activists. And that combined with the claim to religion allowed anti-abortion activists to think about white religious people as abolitionists. And that recreated a racial hierarchy in the United States when it was unstable, right? That white conservatives, they understood their hierarchy now in moral terms, right? That they then were the ones who were at the top of that hierarchy, who, as Carissa said, were now saviors, right? And so, but I think there's also outcomes in terms of gender. I see men and women as co-creators of these logics, these rhetorics, this work, but it affected men and women differently. And I think that women in this movement made this basic trade-off. They accepted increased surveillance and policing around reproduction, believing it wouldn't touch them. Sometimes that was true, sometimes that wasn't. I mean, in exchange, they gained a lot of at least symbolic influence and sometimes practical influence in their denominations. So if uninterrupted reproduction becomes not just important, but primary in determining morality, then women who don't have abortions gain some incredible amount of social power and religious power, right? They become the embodiments of the moral. And this would be especially important for women who felt like the social promises made to them about racial and economic privilege were not fully met. This was the way to sort of shore up a certain amount of social power in one avenue when they felt like they were losing it in another. So I want to just say that I interviewed one woman in Arizona. I want to conclude with her words here. She was one of these like women who had a lot of power in her home, in her work, in her church, born out of this work. And she talked a lot about the importance of religious coalition. She was a Catholic, and she said that, you know, Vatican II had argued for a reconciliation of faiths, but it wasn't possible until they had a common foe. She said the churches couldn't do it on their own. It was abortion that brought us all together. And that's that's sort of what I want to leave you with.
Wow. Wow. So first, I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for some really amazing and rich food for thought. I've been sitting here typing notes as all of you are talking of things that I want to think about more, engage with more. And I want to open it up to our audience to please, any questions, even if you don't have quite a formulated, perfect question yet, if you've got some thoughts bubbling up about things that you've just heard that you'd like to just hear more about, please put it in the Q&A. You can also put it in the chat. And we will spend the next until about 10 after 4, next 20 minutes on taking questions from the audience. And we will also, we'll throw it to Carrie to wrap this up. So I'll also invite panelists, if you have questions for each other, we can take a little time for that as well. So we have, why don't we start with a question from Michelle? And Carissa, you mentioned upcoming book from Dr. Gil Frank. I don't know how much you can speak to this. Carrie, you might know some about it as well. But if you could tell us more about the upcoming book on pro-choice religious people. I'm interested to hear this too.
Sure. So he has a really great website, and it's www.gillian, Gillian Frank, FRANK.com. And the name of his book is called Clergy Counseling Service. Let's see. Oh, Making Choice Sacred. Sorry. Making Choice Sacred is the name of his forthcoming book. Liberal Religion and Reproductive Rights Before Roe v. Wade. And I can give you just a thumbnail sketch on the Clergy Counseling Service, and maybe Jennifer can too. And this is just from lecturing, from teaching. But it's an organization that was formed in 1967 in New York. Primarily consisted of Protestant clergy and rabbis, and they helped to ferry women from states where abortion was illegal to places where it was either legal or they trusted a physician. And these physicians had to sign pledges not to overcharge women. They had to agree to be inspected regularly to make sure that their clinics were safe. So it was this nationwide network to ferry women who needed abortions to places where they could get them safely. It's too bad that he isn't here to talk about it himself.
I know. And
well, I can add a little to that. The Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, as Carissa said, started in 1967 and grew to over 1,400 clergy across the country. Now, it is the case that the Clergy Consultation Service members were all white people. So even there, we see that there was not this coming together across racial groups. And in a time also when much of the focus of Black clergy was on civil rights, but the two issues were not being brought together. And RCRC is the organization that developed out of the Clergy Consultation Service after the passage of Roe v. Wade. Gil's book will be out in 2022. So or maybe early 2023. So it's not yet, but it's coming, it's coming. He has interviewed so many people who were a part of that work. Again, they grew to over 1,400 clergy as part of that work. And it's going to be a great book. But Gil will also be doing a little preview of it in a class lecture that he is doing for the RCRC Learning Center. So check that out until the book, because that'll come out sooner than his book will.
That's awesome. And we also, Faith and Women hosted, I believe this was in 2018. Carrie, I think you were there. And Mel, we hosted Dr. Frank, Dr. Willie Parker, and Reverend Bill Kirby to speak on the clergy consultation service. And Reverend Kirby was actually one of the clergy people who counseled women and helped them access abortion prior to Roe. I believe we have audio of that panel, and that might be something we can talk about, Carrie, including in the learning center. Yeah. So we have a couple of other great questions. I'm going to, let's see, this one from Alice. Where is there opportunity for common ground between progressives and anti-abortion conservatives? And this question is coming from the context of, I'm a college student with a very Catholic mother, and I'm not sure how to reconcile our differences. Much love to you, Alice. I think a lot of us go through that. So yeah, where do we see opportunity for common ground? I'll put that out to all of the panelists.
I think I might just come to this question from the perspective of someone who spends a lot of time cultivating and participating in helping to facilitate conversations with people who come from conservative Christian backgrounds and have left those backgrounds. And I want to say that from that, there is definitely no one size fits all answer. And, you know, sometimes if you go looking in Twitter or other places, you might find some people with a very prescriptive, well, oh, you have to cut her out of your life, or, oh, well, you have to, you know, just you be nice to her or whatever. And the truth is, everyone has to navigate this for themselves, right? It's a really tricky thing. There's not a lot of common ground in terms of ideology or theology, maybe, but you would know better than anyone else what you do have in common with your mother and where you might be able to make connections with her. I can say that in the case of my mom, you know, she has proven to be so committed to kind of trying to just keep the family together and talking to each other. I have more tension with certain other members of my family right now, which is also a source of stress to my mom. But, you know, we can keep in touch and we can just talk about, you know, pop culture, TV that we like or whatever. And sometimes you might get a chance for deeper conversations where you can make sort of a breakthrough. You know, my mom hasn't really, as far as I know, changed her views on homosexuality or being transgender, and certainly not abortion. But my mom does love me, and so she just holds those things in a certain tension. And because I also, you know, love my mom and respect a lot of things about her, I allow those things to be held in tension as well. And it's just kind of a tricky dance that you do. I would say one thing that's important to think about is the issue of boundaries. You know, you're perfectly allowed to set certain boundaries of things that you just don't want to talk about with your mother, for example, because they might cause conflict, or things that you only talk about in certain circumstances. That can be very difficult to do with conservative Christians because often they're not particularly respectful of boundaries. But if you repeatedly enforce the boundary, you know, this may get better over time. For example, my mom no longer, for the most part, tells me I should be going to church, or, you know, tries the passive aggressive. Well, church is a great way to make friends. You know, my mom just mostly doesn't pressure me to go to church anymore. Now that took a long time to get there. But I stuck it out. And I think in general, with conservative Christians in our lives who are anti-choice, you know, they're definitely not going to change their minds overnight. They might sometimes, with patience, you know, change their minds. If you talk about these things once in a while, you might be able to put some new information in front of them, but the relationship has to be based on something other than that, right? There's just no solid relationship to be had in two people wanting to change each other, and that is the whole basis of the relationship. I hope that makes some sense, but it's a tricky thing.
One organization that you might check out with your mother is a group called National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And it's a group that does litigation on behalf of pregnant women. And often it brings together people who are anti-abortion and pro-choice around issues such as incarcerated women who are forcibly shackled during childbirth. That's something that that people on all sides of the spectrum can unite around and see as a particular harm done to pregnant women. And they also do a lot of work on access to healthcare, especially deserts, areas of cities that have very poor maternal health services. So again, I would recommend checking out that group's work as a place where your mother and you might come together and find similar issues to champion.
Thank you for these questions that keep coming in. I also, we kind of touched on the role of CPCs in this bigger conversation, but I wonder if the panelists could talk a little bit more about, specifically about how CPCs function as sort of an outlet for the, maybe employment and energy of white Christian women, and maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yes, I both Chris and I talk a lot about CPCs in our books, and yeah, I mean, this is really fascinating because it's one of the few places where it's like women only. I think that a lot of organizations are women dominated, but this is sort of women only with maybe some men in the board or something, and it's this place where women sort of enact their authority as mothers, but also, and so they can mother these women, these poor women, right, who accidentally, or because they need a free pregnancy test, or because they need the economic support of, the closets with all the children's items they give them, they come in so that, and so they can do that, but also they really expand upon that, right? They're also, they act as doctors often, right? They're like, let me take your urine sample, and let me talk to you about how this body works. And so I think there's a real way in which they use these very conservative principles about what motherhood is and women's roles, and then they expand upon those and really create this expansive domain for themselves that sort of expand their roles. And also, this is this really important place where they generated some of the most important ideas of the movement in the 80s and 90s, especially around this abortion not just damaging fetuses, but damaging women themselves. And that, I think, has just become, especially in the 21st century, one of the most compelling, especially to courts, right? These logics. And these are just, CPCs were where these ideas were played out, implemented, developed in large part.
Thank you. We have a question from Brianna, Thank you all for your fascinating and important presentations. Here's a question for Carissa and Jen specifically, although Chrissy's perspective is welcome as well. Were the activists you discussed single issue activists, or were they organizing around multiple causes? And if so, which ones?
So one of the things that I chart in my book is like how in the 70s, you see people doing multi-issue, like Julie Lesh doing her anti-nuclear, anti-abortion work, but you see it become so disciplined. And Jennifer may have a different take on this, but the way I kind of understood this is that once the anti-abortion movement really, through evangelical Christianity, linked itself to the GOP, there was a disciplining that occurred. So the GOP became so disciplined during the 1980s. And that kind of like rubbed off on any of the constellations around it. And the only kind of other types of activism that I remember hearing from when I interviewed women who were involved in stuff in the 90s and early 2000s was stuff over like resistance to IVF. So it's like abortion adjacent issues, maybe euthanasia, but you really don't see much action around like anti-poverty and anti-abortion like you might have seen in the 60s and 70s. But again, Jennifer may have found different things.
Well, I just want to add, I think this sort of comes back to some of the conversations about race, because they are not working on issues that religious people of color are in their same communities. And so I was especially attentive to trying to figure out whether there were moments where Black evangelicals, Latino Catholics, you know, Native people of whatever stripe, right, that what are there moments where they come in, and why or why not? And what I found was that sometimes there was like a small handful that would sort of jump in for a day or two, but never would be consistently there. And the white activists had very little explanation for why that was the case. And I think that one of the big reasons that I found is that they weren't doing organizing in those communities. They were co-opting their narratives, co-opting their historical movements without actually doing any organizing, and without ever working on any of the issues like sterilization, right? Which you would think, oh, well, that could very well be an issue that an anti-abortion activist might care about, but never was there any work on that, where that they could have built bridges around those, but there wasn't. And they had no good explanations for why. They were like, well, there's people of color who are anti-abortion, they just don't join. We don't know why, you know? And I think because so much of this rhetoric was really co-optation, and because it was so white and seeped in a conservative whiteness, that it was exclusionary in ways that white people just didn't understand why. They didn't get involved in fair housing. They didn't get involved with Chicano issues. They just didn't.
So as I said toward the beginning of my presentation, there were a number of issues that evangelicals, including evangelical women in the community that I grew up in, were concerned with. And they all became sort of like the key social issues for social conservatives and for the Republican Party going ahead. So kind of mobilizing for Republicans, voting for Republicans, being encouraged to always vote. This was a part of activism in which, you know, women in these environments did play a big role, but also men. But if you want to talk about the women activists specifically, and get a little bit beyond just the rhetoric of, you know, prayer back in schools and, you know, we got to stop abortion, and instead of having abortion, let's put adoption out there as an alternative, and we want to stop gay rights. Well, there were other things that people in my community did, and that were particularly often led by women. There was there still is, I think, a mission in downtown Indianapolis to help poorer people, disadvantaged people, homeless people, called Wheeler Mission. So it's a Christian ministry, and my school would often mobilize people to be involved with that in some respects. So one of the major women activists who was just involved in all kinds of things, very energetic, that, you know, I can think of, was involved with organizing things to do with Wheeler Mission. My mom was involved also with organizing things like canned food drives for when they would do soup kitchens and that sort of things. They also had programs to try to help homeless people find jobs, and they had like a youth center, and they had after school tutoring, which is actually something that I volunteered with. And that was organized mainly by women who were either like, you know, closely involved mothers at the Christian school, or who were teachers at the Christian school. I look at this now and I see a lot of paternalism in the way that it was done, and certainly in the way that we thought about, you know, going downtown or going into the quote unquote ghetto, you know, and a lot of sort of awkward racial dynamics in play. And also, you know, white high school kids, we didn't really know how to teach kids how to read, let alone know anything about the culture of the mostly African-American kids that we were going in to try to tutor in reading, because they were behind grade level according to the standardized tests. And the relationships that we forged with that were often not particularly stable, but that was something that we did. And that women were highly involved with organizing. Yeah, there was one Puerto Rican teacher in our school for a long time. And I remember one time at Wheeler Mission, as you know, someone who was there as a volunteer in this reading tutoring program, we had these little stickers with like faces to put on things, like smiley faces and whatever, and they were all just white. So this Puerto Rican teacher was like, she started coloring them in with different skin tone, darker markers, and so we did some brown faces here and some black faces, and I, was struck by that because I would never have thought of it myself, and that sort of thing was important. We had maybe a few people there sometimes who could kind of make you notice something like that, but not very often. So yeah, some kinds of community service, but very, very paternalistic, I guess I would say. Not necessarily that everything about it was bad, but very much white savior sort of stuff that did go beyond working at or volunteering for or having diaper drives and baby formula drives for the CPCs.
So thank you. We have time for one last comment, and then we will wrap up from here. So this is a comment that I will summarize from Annette about how white rhetoric is also shared by Black people who are anti-choice. Even though Black people are coming from a history of slavery, illegal sterilization, and just an overall lack of bodily autonomy. And I wonder if, Carrie, you could speak to that. I know you've got some plans in the works for upcoming panels that might actually be able to get into that a little bit more.
Yes, and I want to be clear, I'm not responding to this because I'm the Black person here in this panel, but I just have very strong and particular perspectives on this. So I asked our moderator if she would direct it to me. I want to be clear about that. It is so amazing that we have this intersection of respectability politics that plays along with the issues of the discrimination, the genocide, et cetera, and the bodily control of Black people on these soils since we've been here. And I talk about respectability politics because of all the things that Karissa and Jen and Chrissy spoke about, how the issue of abortion became politicized and then used that to create this para-church kind of experience for many people that has been very, very powerful. In the context of something that has been made a moral issue, when it used to be an issue of personal autonomy, the moment evangelicals and Catholics, and I say some because I know it's not all of them, but the moment those groups made it a moral issue, how that intersected with respectability politics for many Black clergy in particular has been very problematic. And so the idea we are, upstanding, we are moral as Black people because we want white people to know that, became something that for many people superseded the issue of the lack of autonomy for Black bodies across the centuries. And so that's a big part of the work that we need to do. And I'm hoping we will have a webinar specifically on that topic this summer when we resume our webinar series, because I think it's a very, very important one. And I know we need to go, but I got to say this really quickly. One of our dear friends had a student who was in seminary and as a seminary student was leading a group discussion and of all women and all Black women, and the women, one woman said one day, I don't know if I'll be in the group today because I had an abortion today and I think I might need a different kind of space. The seminary student encouraged this woman to come and share her experience with the rest of the group. And there were about 10 women in the group. As they discovered, about 7 of them had had abortions. And it was the first time they'd been able to speak that in their all Black church. And so we really need to create a different way of relating with this issue and shift the moral compass from this notion that abortion is murder based on absolutely horrific science, is a lack of science, and churches having changed their teaching through the year. So, so it's been a variety of things. But in the Learning Center, we're going to do some really exciting course with a number of amazing scholars, ethicists, theologians, all of these people looking at the issue of personhood. Because the moment this conflation happened about when does life begin, when does personhood begin, then the rhetoric has been that it is murder. And so Black folks wanting to be respectable, some are saying don't have abortion, and yet many Black people have abortions along with people from all other races. But then there's also all of this guilt and shame about it because of a whole bunch of horrible theology and politics and on and on. So I really appreciate your question about that. We really need to look at that. Now I'm here. I really want to encourage you to come to our very, very last panel on March 30th, looking at the legislative tactics, looking behind the scenes so we can see what those are and really place ourselves in a different way in relation to that. So please, please, please come to that. But I cannot say thank you enough to our amazing panelists. I love these webinars because I'm learning something every time. And I was sitting throughout our time today saying, oh, wow, oh, really? Oh, yeah, I love that. And so Carissa and Chrissy and Jen, thank you so much, or I should say doctors to all of you. And Ashley, absolute wonderful moderation today. And thank you for the incredible work that you and Faith in Women do in a very hostile environment for women in Mississippi. And we've got to keep looking at all of the statistics that show how many women do not trust other women to make decisions and choices for their lives. And it shows up in our workplaces that many women don't like women bosses because they don't, but it also shows up in matters of reproduction. And so we have a lot of work to do with regard to women trusting women in their own decision-making. And so I hope we'll keep having these conversations and moving these important discussions forward. Love and blessings to all of you. And thank you all who have participated. I hate that we can't see you, but please know that we do feel you and appreciate you every time we have one of these webinars. Blessings to you.